Today's conversation is part of a Moment series on antisemitism supported by the Joyce and Irving Goldman Family Foundation. The program is also part of the Wide River Project, a year-long joint initiative of Western State Center and Moment Magazine that takes a deep dive and fresh look into the art, history, and issues that both unite and divide the Black and Jewish communities. Now for today's program. Dr. Lillie Johnson-Edwards is Professor Emerita of History and African American Studies at Drew University, where she served as Director of Pan-African Studies and American Studies and received awards for distinguished teaching and service before retiring in 2016. She received her doctorate in history from the University of Chicago and is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Oberlin College, where she currently serves as Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees. Dr. Edwards has published several articles on African American women in religion in encyclopedia and anthologies. Her biography for pre-teens, Denmark Vesey, won the New York Public Library Book for the Teenage. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History presented her with the Mary McLeod Bethune Service Award for her contributions and service. As a public historian, Dr. Edwards consults with K-12 educators and school districts and lectures for libraries, historical societies, museums, corporations, and civic organizations, such as the New Jersey NAACP, the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., and Apple Inc. Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist and author. She has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine since 2004 and is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine's most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Dr. Lillie Edwards and Nadine Epstein.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of our Wide River Project, and to also talk about anti-Semitism in the United States. My co-host, Eric Ward, is not here with us today. He's traveling abroad, but he'll be back for our next episode. So I want to tell you that I stumbled upon today's topic about 15 years ago while I was researching and writing an article about the journalist Edward R. Murrow. I was focused in particular on Murrow's little-known pre-broadcast career at the Institute of International Education in New York City, which helped academics flee Nazi Germany by finding jobs for them in the US, which then allowed them to enter the country. Murrow was secretary of the Institute's Emergency Committee in the Aid of Displaced German Scholars. No one really knows much about this part of Edward R. Murrow's life. He's just not written about. But he found jobs for the scholars, and these jobs were financed by Jewish and other philanthropists at American colleges and universities. Prevalent anti-Semitism and Jewish quotas prevented many more people from being placed and saved. Every day, Murrow received 50 letters a day from scholars. He interviewed from 12 to 15 scholars. He traveled to Europe to meet with them. And when they arrived, he helped take care of them. And they were often in very vulnerable states. In all, the Emergency Committee placed about 288 scholars, and at least 82 that we know that were Jewish. Probably many more were Jewish. HBCUs were among the few places where Jewish refugee professors were welcome. This historic confluence is a very important corner of the American Black-Jewish relationship, which we're going to explore today. Later in 2009, Moment marked Barack Obama's historic inauguration with a special edition on the relationship between Blacks and Jews. We chose and ran iconic photos that told the story of the relationship. One of my favorites is a photo of Ernst Borinsky, who is a German Jewish professor with his students, and it was a photo from Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And we're going to learn more about him and hear more about him today. So why is this such an important topic and such a unique story? It's because it reminds us, this era reminds us the channels of the relationship between American Blacks and Jews are not always negative. And we have a lot to learn from this era. That's why today we're so delighted to host our special guest, Dr. Lillie Edwards, to help us dive into this era and to understand it. We want to understand its legacy and what we can learn from it. Lillie, many of us don't much about HBCUs at all. How did they come about? What are they and how did they come about?
that's a perfect place to start, because for the most part, before the campaign and then election of Vice President Kamala Harris, people really didn't pay very much attention to HBCUs. But then with her election, Howard University suddenly kind of appears on the screen. But we're talking about institutions founded in the 19th century. At this point, the Department of Education in the US government actually does kind of have a criteria for distinguishing which schools qualify as HBCUs. They're Black institutions founded primarily for African Americans prior to 1965. Presently, the count is somewhere around 101 institutions in the United States. I'll repeat that, 101 institutions. So we're not talking about a small platform within higher education in America. There were colleges that actually started before Reconstruction, such as Wilberforce in Ohio, and also Cheney Institute in 1837. I believe we have a picture from Cheney. Let me see which picture that is. We have one from Payne College. That's number 17. So if we could pull that slide up. I love to show these pictures of essentially Victorian Black people. We're seeing men and women in their finest decorum, men and women of very, very high ambition. And when you look at this kind of picture from 1882 of Payne College, founded by the Methodist Church, you get a sense of both Black ambition, Black social mobility, and the importance of education in the Black community. If you could pull up the slide just before that, number 16, where we have a list of, I've listed for you some sense of how these schools were founded. Most of them, almost all of them, with the few exceptions, founded after the Civil War, and most of them founded in the South. They were founded by Black and white denominations. You saw the example of Payne College that was started by the Methodists. Howard University was really started by the Freedmen's Bureau. You also have private founders, African-American educators who start their own colleges, such as Mary McLeod Bethune begins her college in Florida. And then the second moral act, the Land Grant Act, created African-American agricultural colleges, such as our A&T colleges in various agriculture and technology colleges for African Americans all over the South. And so we can go back to the conversation screen. And so Nadine, we're talking about by the time of the Nazi regime and the expulsion of Jewish refugee scholars, as well as any scholars that would not be loyal to the Nazi regime, those who did not adhere to fascism, who were expelled. We're talking about institutions by the 1930s that are fairly well established, right? They're in their third, fourth generation of existence for those founded before the Civil War. And for others, we're talking about being in the second generation.
So they're very unique spaces in the American educational system. And let's lay out the tableau of the 1930s. So there's a lot going on in the 1930s, so much of it that we've forgotten. Something's happening in Nazi Germany. There's racism here in the United States, and there's anti-Semitism. Can you tell us a little bit about the confluence of all these? And tell us about more. Tell us about what's happening in the United States.
Yeah, so it really is the confluence of all of the things you've just listed that makes this particular episode, as well as the particular relationship between these Jewish scholars, these Jewish refugee scholars, and their efforts to find a home, right? Once they're expelled from throughout Nazi Germany. And it is also the story of anti-Semitism and race relations in the United States. And these converge in some ways. Most scholars haven't written about how they converge. And so I really have taken parts of the work that other people have done. So I want to give credit to the researchers who've actually done the primary research and the publications, such as Gabrielle Simon Edgecombe, who wrote the book From Swastika to Jim Crow, as well as the filmmakers who created a film, a documentary, where we hear the professors and their students from these HBCUs talking about their personal experiences. And of course, there's nothing more powerful than hearing these professors and their students reminisce about that interesting space where these Jewish professors come together with African-American culture, as well as the larger landscape of segregation, discrimination, and racial violence in the South from the 1930s on.
So Jews can't get jobs. Let's step back a second. In order to come to this country, we have the refugee professors, and they're not all Jewish, but many of them are Jewish, need to get jobs to be able to be in the country. And they can't get jobs. Why is it so hard to find these brilliant professors? Really, we're talking about the creme de la creme of Germany, which is like at the time, the leading country of education in the world, really. Why can't they find jobs in the United States? What's going on in the university, in the academic world?
Well, there are pockets of scholars, Jewish refugee scholars, and pockets of institutions where, in fact, they can settle in fairly quickly. And so Albert Einstein has no problem finding a position in the United States. He is, in fact, already a kind of, icon in the United States, and had visited earlier. And so he has a following in the United States. So for the professors who are well-established and renowned, they really can land, but that's going to be a kind of tiny elite minority among those scholars. The New School in New York City also becomes a place where people can land fairly quickly and land comfortably. And the New School itself creates an entire program within the institution to welcome Jewish refugee scholars. That is very rare in the 1930s and 40s. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in higher education. Very often we like to assume that somehow higher education is above all of this and exists in some realm of pure objectivity. That is not true at all. If you could pull up, I think slide number 10, we'll begin to look at a couple of examples of this, beginning with Harvard University and President Abbott Lawrence Lowell, the 22nd president of Harvard University, between 1909 and 1933, essentially created a refined policy, not just a whim with a quota, but actually define a system whereby Jewish students would essentially would become, a smaller part of the pool and smaller part of admissions. What he said is, you should see on screen, it is natural that with a widespread discussion of this sort going on, there should be talk about the proportion of Jews at the college. And so what Lowell puts into place is something that is adopted throughout the United States, and that is not only are there admissions quotas for Jewish students as well as faculty, there are also changes in admissions policy. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of those examples, I believe. So for example, this is when colleges begin to say, we will have geographical distribution. And so this means that most Jews in America are living, most, not all, are living in urban environments. It means that we can shrink the number of students coming from urban areas. There's also a statement about we don't have to have such high academic standards, right? That is that is an interesting twist on admissions. It is neither feasible nor desirable to raise the standards of the college so high that none but brilliant scholars can enter. And so there's, in some ways, the opposite of the current discussion, right? There's the idea that we need to have a slightly lower bar so that we don't exclude white students who are mediocre. And then this is the beginning of the process of having a photo and also creating legacy admissions. And so you automatically begin to get a smaller and smaller pool of Jewish students. Let's see the next slide as well, which I think is very compelling. This is a book by Dr. Perry Brickman, who wrote about his experience in the dental school at Emory University. And in this book, he talks about anti-Semitism in white Americans' higher education, including his own experience, where he knows that Jewish students in Emory's dental school were told that his people did not have the hands for that type of work. And then one of the most egregious examples of the anti-Semitism within college culture is in the next slide, a song from the 1910s that reads, "Oh, Harvard's run by millionaires and Yale is run by booze, Cornell is run by pharmacists, Columbia is run by Jews. So give a cheer for Baxter Street and another one for Pell, but when the blank die, their souls will go to hell." This is a college song. And so we see in every part of higher education in America, whether it's quotas for faculty, quotas for students, changing the admissions process and priorities, and college culture. At every place we see anti-Semitism embedded into both processes, protocols, and here, into college culture as well.
So just, you told me something the other day, which I didn't know, that many of the historic Black colleges and universities were actually led by had white professors and white presidents, not all of them. But what makes the HBCUs so different? Why are they able to accept, why do they want to accept the Jewish scholars? They don't have quotas, obviously. But they could have had quotas, who knows? I mean,
but they didn't. I mean, I think that becomes very important when you think about the founding of these schools, starting with Howard and others in 1866 and 1867, immediately after the Civil War, and the way in which African Americans prize first literacy and then second higher education, and the ambition to become professionals in giving back to the community. There is no, in some ways, there's no cultural space for exclusion of anyone, right? HBCUs are founded on the idea of we have been excluded in the past, and therefore we must open our doors to educate as many people as possible, and that education has an intrinsic value in that education is linked to freedom itself, right? And so when you look at this example, these examples from Harvard and Emory, and I intentionally gave you two institutions, completely different parts of the country. One is the entire college at Harvard. One example is a medicine and dental school. And Brickman points out this is happening at medical and dental schools all over the country at the same time. There is no space for that kind of exclusion at all at HBCUs. So that's one, you're correct. So the second thing would be these scholars actually are bringing to HBCUs fields of study that they need. And so for the most part, when the matching is done, there is an effort to identify what subjects do HBCUs need. So it isn't just viewed as some sort of rescue mission. It really is a win-win for the scholar and for the institution. Almost all of them end up teaching German. The exception may be perhaps some of those who are in the arts and printmaking and the visual arts. But for the most part, they all teach German because German at that time is considered to be the, kind of at the center of a liberal arts education for all institutions. And so that skill in particular, the language skill, even if they aren't trained as German professors, they bring that to those institutions. And I have friends even here where I live in my own church who, when they saw the film, remembered, oh, I remember this particular professor, which also tells us Black students were not, did not identify these professors so much as being Jewish. They identified them as being white because these schools are in the South, and race is a negotiated space 24 hours a day, right? And so that convergence in 1933 of kind of Black ambition and the academic space for these professors is a very important one. It is interesting, and we should realize only about Edgecombe's count for the number of professors is only about 51 or 52. There are scholars who now assume that number is higher, but that there was no necessary Jewish identity to these professors at these schools. And so we may not have the entire list of who they were at these various institutions. So in addition to that, we have the dehumanization of Jews by Nazi Germany. And one of the things I suggest in the talks I give about this is anti-Semitism was alive and well, not only on college campuses, but it has a very long history from the founding of the nation, where, you know, in colonial era, where Jews aren't allowed to own property, for example, or aren't allowed to vote. Essentially you have the kind of replication of the European ghetto is transplanted into early America. And then with Nazi Germany, of course, you get the vilification of Jews as a race, and the construction, really, of Jews as a race, since we know someone has to make that up. It doesn't really exist as a biological reality. And so one of the things that is often missing in US history that Ken Burns is trying to make up for in his recent documentary, right, about anti-Semitism in the United States, is that there were, you know, there was it's always very mainstream pro-Nazi, pro-German, anti-Semitic movement in the United States in the 1930s, all the way up to the war. You can put up a couple of the slides I have that where I try and demonstrate this. Slide number 7 is of the German-American Bund parade in 1937. And what you see in this parade down the streets of New York City is a celebration of Nazism on East 86th Street. We also have examples, as many of you know, of Jewish refugees, including refugee children. We can pull up slide 8, Jewish refugees and including children being kind of turned around, right? And being told you can't come into the United States. And there's a quote in the next slide by a cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where Laura Delano says, 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow up into 20,000 ugly adults. We have the examples of kind of even longer lists of the Ku Klux Klan reorganized, kind of reappears after it was really shut down by the federal government during Reconstruction, reappears as anti-Catholic, anti-Black, and anti-Semitic. We have examples of Father Coughlin, who has kind of millions of followers all over the country, who are listening to this kind of virulent hatred against Jews. And then we have kind of icons of American industry like Henry Ford, and kind of American idols like Charles Lindbergh, who are ardently pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic. And so in some ways, we're talking about a space where anti-Semitism in America is itself the norm. And so when the emergency committee is trying to place Jewish professors, they are very conscious of placing the most famous and well-known because they know their quotas and it's going to be difficult. The real problem is going to be with junior professors who've not yet proven themselves. They're very careful. So the emergency committee initially is thinking this Nazi problem is going to go away very soon. We hear people say things like that now, right? And then we're proven wrong when the bombs fall. So the committee really is assuming this is temporary. And so we can try and place these professors and ensure to universities, these Jewish professors won't be there that long anyway, and they can go back. Of course, that is not how the 1930s and 40s unfold at all. And the committee really does become more and more and more concerned about the kind of permanence of bringing in these Jewish scholars. The other thing we have to remember, it is the Jewish community paying for most of this, right? So there's really a coalition of American Friends Service Committee, Rockefeller Foundation, Protestant churches, the Emergency Committee. I mean, ultimately, there's a national coalition of people working on this, but the money that pays for these professors to come and find a location, that is primarily coming from the Jewish community itself. Kind of all the way back to Jewish settlement efforts in 1914 from the First World War. So those same groups that were trying to find homes for Jews from Europe and of course from Russia as well, are still operating and are really at the center of this work. And then finally, Nadine, this is a period still of legal segregation in the United States for Black people. Most of these professors are going south, which is where most HBCUs are, with very few exceptions. This is a space that is very violent. The Equal Justice Initiative has shown us there are hundreds and thousands of Black people murdered, and the murderers go free, kind of with impunity. You know, men, women, and children are murdered. Black towns, like we have, much of America is now discovered, that Black towns and business districts are burned down with, again, with impunity. And so these rigid Black-white racial lines is also a space that these refugee professors walk into and then have to navigate, and that they are kind of not quite in any of those worlds, right? They are not in a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant world. They are not in the camp with white segregationists. They work with absolutely every day Black colleagues and Black students. They are going to chapel every day.
Yes, you said it's a very Christian environment, and then
it is a very Christian.
Jews, some of them secular, most of them are secular Jews, really.
Yes,
but they have to go to chapel, and their kids go to chapel. And
yes,
tell us about it's very
right, because they also, I mean, one of the things that happens to those that have spend their entire career at an HBCU, like Berensky at Talladega, like Lerner at West Virginia State University, where you're talking about really their entire career, decades, spent at these schools and in these communities. It means that they, in fact, learn to navigate in this, in some ways, a very fluid space where they can move in and out of communities. But there's a wonderful story, I believe it's Professor Lerner in West Virginia, where he writes that he did not go to certain conferences because he knew his colleagues couldn't go and stay in the hotel.
Well, let's pause here. That's a really interesting story. Let's pause here. Why don't you tell us about some of your favorite scholars, or the scholars that had a lot of impact? I mean, one of the things that's really important to point out is these scholars had a lot of influence on their students and on the schools that these are brilliant people who are just dropped into these worlds, and everyone is they're really valued. And tell us about, I know you mentioned Ernst Borinsky, and I mentioned him earlier too, because he's somebody who stayed there at Tuvalu his entire career. I mean, he didn't go off and change jobs. He was really committed, and he was a sociologist. But tell us a little bit about him, and then maybe some of a couple other favorites. So.
Right. Borinsky is a really good place to start, because in some ways he, to me, represents the most hopeful, as you said, most hopeful kind of relationships between the Jewish community and the Black community. We have a picture of him on slide 23.
There's a lot of photos of him, by the way. He seems like there are more photos of him with his white students, with his Black students, than of any other professor. So I think that's because also he stayed his whole career. Right. But he seems like he's also like a character, and there he is. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So he was there for such a long time, as you can see. He was there for 36 years, and so we're talking about 2 whole generations of students. So one could have been a student, and then your child could have also been a student. And he was so impactful, not only in teaching German and Russian, as I said earlier, that simply was expected of many of these professors, but he was trained as a sociologist. And one of the things that makes Borinsky so unique among some other German Jewish scholars who were interested in studying what was then called the Negro problem, and had this kind of anthropological view of studying Black people as almost anthropological specimens. Borinsky did not. Borinsky's focus was much more on race relations themselves, a focus on discrimination and segregation and inequality. And what he fostered for his students, I think we have a picture of that in the next slide, which is, I believe, slide 24. Borinsky formed what he's really famous for, is he formed this social science lab, not for Borinsky, the sociologist, to study Black people, but for his students to study the conditions of society and to be able to critique those conditions, to be able to problem solve. What made that social science research laboratory revolutionary is that he had the nerve in Mississippi to invite white students to sit with the Black students in his social science labs, which at the time, as you all may know, was actually illegal for him to do that. And it would have been a kind of just a first-time experience for both the Black and white students to be sitting around a table next to each other. Would have been unheard of and would have never have occurred in either student's experience. And then finally, one of the most powerful things about Borinsky is that his story is being told by one of his most renowned students, Dr. Joyce Ladner, who went on to herself become one of the seminal sociologists studying African Americans and race relations. And she attributes her success in part to Borinsky's mentorship, to Borinsky believing in her that she should go on for her doctorate, and he paid for her application to graduate school, as she talks about in the film. So Dr. Ladner has made it part of her work to go out and tell this story from her firsthand experience with Professor Berinsky. And in the documentary film From Swastika to Jim Crow, which I highly recommend to everyone, you hear other students talking about the significance of Berinsky opening up the world to them. One talks about Berinsky saying, you should apply for Fulbright, when this student has no idea what a Fulbright is. And so his commitment to the institution and to students, I think, is singular in its depth and breadth. And it also is wonderful in that it shows us what the possibilities are in human relations.
So I find him very inspirational as well. But I think there's also, what's the art professor who was in Virginia or West Virginia? I mean, tell us about, what was that? Was that Lerner?
Yes, so there, what I'd like to interject here, though, is one of the things, there's a let me look at my own notes. There's a 2019 article written by Sarah Samuels at University of Pennsylvania, where she's looking at, she really is doing research on the emergency committee itself and the HBCUs. And one of the things she points out, rightfully so, that we don't want to paint this picture of, this through kind of rose-colored glasses, that somehow this was, the perfect convergence of oppressed people coming together at HBCUs. Rather, we do see the possibility in someone like a Berinsky, but then we do have stories where it simply didn't work at all. And so one of the examples is Lisps at Howard University, spent only 1 year there. And the problems were just so contentious that it was even public and involved newspaper articles. And it was what we would now say really messy. It was very messy. With him resigning, but Howard publicly says, no, he didn't resign. We asked him to leave. So it was, yeah, there was a lot of drama. And it wasn't pretty at all. It was just virulent between the professor and the dean and the president of Howard. It even involved what was then called the Journal of Negro History. So it blew up, we will say.
So I absolutely, I understand that. But I'm really curious about Victor Lowenfeld. I think that's the professor that I meant to, that was his name.
And I think I have a picture of him as well. Let me see which one is that. Picture of Lowenfeld is slide 22. Victor Lowenfeld actually went to Howard as head of the art department. And similar to Berinsky, he was the inspiration for not only creating the industrial arts department, he was the first person appointed to that position. As you can see on the slide, he was the chair of the art department. And I meant to say Hampton. We both said Howard, I think. And yeah, meant to say Hampton, in Virginia, Hampton, Virginia. And he was the curator of the Black African art collection, which to this day, Hampton is renowned for its Black art collection. It's one of the best collections in the entire country. And what he is also known for is he was the mentor and inspiration for some of the most renowned Black artists that came out of his classes. He only stayed at Hampton for, I believe it's something like 7 or 8 years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Something like that. And that's true for several people in the arts who initially are at HBCUs and then end up in New York City or at larger universities. Mm-hmm. When we look at, for example, the 1940s, 50s, unlike Berinsky, Manasseh at North Carolina Central University, the couple, both Manasseh, stayed there for their entire careers as well. I think we have a picture of one of her paintings, number 21. The Manassas stayed their entire career at North Carolina. I'm sorry.
Can I just pop in a second? So there's very few women in this group, by the way. She's one, because she's a couple, it sounds like, but are there any other women who are, I mean, obviously, Emmy Nutter, who I wrote about in the book I did with Justice Ginsburg, who was Jewish, but who ended up at Bryn Mawr and not at a HBCU, was a woman. But it seems like, were there any other women that you know of? But I want to see the photo. We should see the photo of this woman too, but.
Right. There were, this is one of her paintings that I used to at least show that as a member of the art department. And as I said earlier, almost everyone was a German professor. That this is one of her artworks that actually is currently, I think, in a collection at Duke in Durham. Where you see her using the Black farm workers as the subjects of this particular painting. Wow. There were women who were, part of this refugee group. Many of them, and in some ways it's not surprising, were actually among those elite scholars. There were very few of them. Where we do have women scholars, they were very, very elite. Some, in fact, do go to Bryn Mawr, which is one of the places they go to, as well as the New School.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of any on the list for the South, and no names come to mind.
Well, let's go back to the woman you just showed us her artwork, because she's really doing kind of, I mean, are there a lot of Americans who are doing, like white Americans who are doing artwork about African-American community at that point? Or is she bringing some unique way of looking, at the world?
That's a question I can't answer. I'm not as well versed in that art history world to be able to speak usefully on that topic. I do know that there are other art professors who go to HBCUs.
Okay.
And so Rudy Lesser goes to Howard. I learned about him through the Fritz Asher Society in New York City, did a program on him. He was not at Howard for a very long time. It wasn't that there were any problems, but as soon as he had an opportunity as an artist to go to New York City, he did.
Okay. New York was a big draw for the refugees.
Understandably, and especially for that time period, of course, when we were talking about the creation of a certain kind of postmodern art in the 1940s in particular.
Well, I wanted just to look about, and obviously this is, I don't mean to paint this is all an idyllic picture, because as you pointed out, it's not. But what can we learn from this sort of convergence of, what kind of, lessons can we today take from how HBCUs welcomed Jewish refugee professors who might have died otherwise, and then how they influenced their students and how they were influenced by their universities and their new communities? What kind of lessons can we take from that today?
Well, one of the things I like to always remind audiences of is the kind of the power of collaboration and coalitions. If we pull up slide 25, I use this also as an example to show that, what we may see as inspiring in someone like a Lowenfeld and Berinsky is part of a longer history of Black Jewish relations that are extremely powerful and effective in the founding of the NAACP as a multi-ethnic, multiracial organization. The Scottsboro Defense, where we had Jewish lawyers and Rosa Parks sitting in the same room, which is a very powerful picture. These faculty at HBCUs, the power of the Legal Defense Fund, which still exists, obviously. And then the contemporary civil rights movement, when we have Rabbi Prince, Rabbi Heschel, and the Jewish students who die and are murdered in the Mississippi Summer Project, giving their lives, right, for the civil rights of really for all people. And so when we put this particular episode in that larger framework, what I see as the lessons of the 21st century, for the 21st century, is that there are possibilities, and that we know those possibilities really happen. It isn't that we have some idealistic utopian vision of something that may be almost impossible. But here's the other thing, Nadine. We know that it's really hard to cross these boundaries that are not only kind of centuries old, but they are boundaries that are embedded so very deeply into the American psyche of difference and separation and competition and power on one hand. And on the other hand, there's this, all people are created equal and endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights.
Yes,
right. And so the two coexist and have coexisted from the very beginning, right? The enslavement of Black people, anti-Semitism, the subjugation of women, the efforts to erase Native peoples, all of those are embedded along with those high ideals and principles of the Enlightenment. And so when we look at that fracture that we still live with, we must always see within that the healing moments, right? Those healing moments, which are always there. They are always there. If we only look at the fracture, all we get is more fracture, right? Yeah, we continue to tear each other apart. But if we acknowledge that the fracture exists, we shouldn't ignore it, because it's so very real in day-to-day life, not just, in systems and protocols. People live through that fracture, those fractures of discrimination and dehumanization. But we can, with that landscape, still know that there is work to do, and that work bears fruit, right? That it really can make a difference in people's lives. If we show the very last slide that I've sometimes used, slide 27, this is just a group of children's books. And I love the one that you'll see on the far right of the screen, where it's a story about Mrs. Katz and Tush, and about how they formed this relationship, like almost kind of telling each other stories. And that this little Black boy and this elderly Jewish woman could become friends, I think is the ultimate story for all of us.
You've also talked about, how we have to fight erasure. I mean, the Nazis were trying to erase Jews from humanity, not just from German life, but from humanity. And how does this all connect? I mean, tell us a little bit about erasure and how we have to fight erasure, the urge to erase in society today.
Well, the scariest thing for me is that I see versions of this all the time. And it begins by putting, sort of using the word them as if there are separate categories of humanity, right? And once you label people as being in some category of humanity that you yourself are not in, then you've already entered what I call that slippery slope of how far will you take that idea of this human being is unlike other human beings. And what we see in the case, of course, of whether it's Nazi Germany and pictures of European immigrants being seen as rats jumping off of a ship. I don't have a picture of that, but it's in my head because it can't leave me. You know, it is the idea of the immigrant being a rodent and being vermin and being dangerous and being unwanted and definitely not human. It's no different than if you're in Rwanda and the Tutsi are called cockroaches over and over and over again, right? In the media and newspaper and radio. And then what do you do with cockroaches? You kill them. You kill the babies, the old people, the men, the women, that's
Yes.
what you do. And so what I teach my students, and I like using this public platform also to say to people, these kind of words and categories of dehumanization are never innocent because it always begins someplace. That people aren't building concentration camps in the beginning. They're vilifying, they're labeling. You know, there's, you know, Kristallnacht, and you're, you know, kind of destroying property. You know, it reminds me of the destruction of Black towns, kind of, you don't belong here. And here's the thing that we should all be frightened of, that throughout Germany and other places in Europe as well, people's neighbors disappeared. And these were neighbors they had known their entire lives for 20, 25, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Neighbors that disappeared. And that was not enough to send up a national outrage, right? Yeah. That I don't mean the system, I mean my own neighbors who I have known can disappear, and then I don't respond as if, in fact, I respond as if they never existed as my neighbors at all. And so one of the things I think this tells us is how personal this space is. Of course, is institutional, it is political systems, it is protocols, it's processes, it's law, but it is also highly personal and up to individuals to take a stand and always, always affirm the humanity of absolutely everybody, because you know, once you turn in that direction of othering and saying them, where it could lead, and it's a place you don't want to go.
So, lesson, we always have to choose humanity. We always have to choose the way of love. Thank you. That's a great place for us to end, because we're almost out of time, but we are going to have you back to talk about some of these other eras where the other connections between the Black and Jewish community in the United States that I think are very important to dive into. But I know I want to leave some time for questions. So Suzanne, want to pop back on?
Yes, thank you so much. I think all of us could just sit here and listen to you teach us all day. So thank you very, very much for that. Somebody had written in earlier that the father of one of their medical school colleagues was a dentist in Germany. And when he came to America, in order to become certified in the United States, he had to redo part of his graduate education. And he did that at Howard University.
Right.
So
that also is not surprising that was done at Howard.
Yeah, Howard was very welcoming to Jews. That had a social work school that was a lot of Jews attended. It was that's a whole different story. I mean, Howard being in Washington, D.C. was a little more unique. I think it had more white students, perhaps.
Exactly. Well, the other thing with Howard is they also could afford to pay the professors, although the emergency committee was organizing getting the refugees into the country, finding places for them. I forgot to mention that each of these schools actually had to take over paying the salaries of these new professors.
Oh, really? So after a certain amount of time, the philanthropy ended?
Yes, the school itself was paying the salaries. Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. How interesting. Yeah. Okay.
So two different questions, but very similar. Do you know if Jewish communities kind of sprouted around some of the HBCUs in those communities. And then somebody else wanted to know what was life like for these professors? Was there segregation beyond the campus? Was there socializing with colleagues? Was it different in terms of urban areas like DC versus a place like Mississippi?
Yes, 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 to all those questions. So, let me start with the ones in the South, where we have to remember, in part, segregation is kind of social and cultural, but segregation is written in law. People get arrested for breaking the law, like, the marriage laws in Virginia, where the Lovings are put in jail. That, this isn't, in some ways, the whims of a few racist people. It really is community regulated. And so for something like Berinsky having Black and white students, not going over to Mississippi, right, to University of Mississippi, he brought the students from Jackson to Tougaloo, right? But it was illegal. And so in their daily lives, what some of these professors talk about, the ones who actually were there for a long time, talk about not being able to navigate freely in the segregated space. So they could not sit and have a meal with their colleagues. For many of them, they lived in the white community. And so I can't remember if it was Berinsky or one of the other, it may have been Berinsky, talks about being threatened by neighbors because he had his Black colleagues come over for dinner, and that was dangerous. The children of these refugees in the film talk about kind of being the odd kids who hung out at with these Black people at this Black campus, but how it left them space to kind of define themselves any way they wanted to. So they could, they said they always had a Christmas tree because everybody had a Christmas tree. They were not part, typically, of a much larger Jewish community. They were either within the Black college community or within the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community. Some of these communities had a synagogue and a Jewish population, but very small at that time. What was the other question? I forgot.
I think we've covered. I think we're good. So for one thing, some people have asked about HBCU, and that stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Just so I know, not everybody's familiar with the
right.
term.
I meant to say that earlier, and that is another. I mean, the topic may not be central to the mission of Moment Magazine, but that is another topic that people may find interesting, just to hear about the history of HBCUs and how
it's very fascinating to
how central they have been to not only the evolution of the Black middle class and professional class, but actually forming the leadership, much of the leadership of the civil rights movement, and really being at the heart of the Black Power movement as well, are Black college students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Morehouse, for example, that's had a huge impact.
Well, yeah, of course, from, if nothing else, as the place where Martin Luther King went as a teenager, actually.
Yeah.
But many, if you think about North Carolina A&T and those students doing sit-ins, the same thing is true throughout HBCUs throughout the South. Sit-ins at Nashville by Fisk students, sit-ins in Atlanta with both Spelman and Morehouse students, in some ways breaking very clear rules of decorum that Black college students were supposed to maintain as the representatives of Black middle class sensibilities and respectability, and in some ways a very conservative side, right, of the need to represent in a certain way, in a normative way, that appeased white culture. And then you have in the 1950s, they become the vanguard of direct action in a way that even Martin Luther King can't rein them in, which he does try to do, but it doesn't work.
We're going to get into that wrinkle another time, by the way.
Yes.
It's
yes.
an important wrinkle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know if in today, is this chapter in history ever talked about at the HBCUs, and do current students, are they aware of it?
Sure. Actually, that's a very good question. I mean, what I've seen is that the professors who are there a very long time and clearly helped to define the institutions at a pivotal moment, like the 1940s, 50s, right, would have been really pivotal moments at these institutions, a kind of transition into the student direct action period. That most of these schools themselves have recognized, either with some sort of naming or award within a department or the institution, the contributions of these scholars. But I'm not sure the students or alumni themselves frame their former professors now in a refugee space. I think they just see them as, this was my professor.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and he had a German accent.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is pretty normal for students in college. You know, you don't often know that much about your professors. You just walk in and start learning.
Right. In some ways, we are pedestaled.
Yeah.
And so kind of, the fact that we have to wash dishes and do laundry is lost on students. Yeah, that's not how they see us in the classroom.
And then bringing it back to today, a lot of Jews feel that with the Black Lives Matter movement, that the Jews are seen as not welcome, and feel like there's some anti-Semitism within the movement. What are your thoughts on that? And then what is your takeaway from today's program and how to improve Black and Jewish relationships today?
Well, that's
Big
a hard
questions.
question, but let's do some truth telling here. That's always a good space to be in, and that is, I always think about the fact we live in America. And we all live within that embedded anti-Semitism and anti-Black space. And so I do not expect or assume that anyone who lives in this space is not impacted by it. And so I will assume that Americans have all sorts of stereotypes and assumptions about Black people. I will assume that Americans, from sea to shining sea, have all sort of assumptions about who Jews are. And I'm willing to bet that most of what people think on either side is really wrong, because it's based upon the stereotypes as well as certain kind of cultural cues from newspapers, television, etc. As to who people are. What I hope is that there are spaces, and I'm working with a group, I'm a member of a group here in Montclair called Race Amity. And the idea is that we have to be honest about that impact on all of us, that we all have a lens from the American landscape that has us not see each other as we truly are. Right? It takes work to strip that off. It's surgery, right? It's like cataract surgery. You literally have to take your hand and strip it off, layer by layer, to see who people are. Now, I am grateful that growing up in Columbus, Georgia, in the 1950s, 60s, segregated Columbus, Georgia, that in my own Black household, I assume Jews are the people in the Bible and therefore they're my people. That's what it looked like to me. These are my people. I read about them, and kind of we belong together. But see, that was, I never heard, I didn't understand growing up in my own household any other, that was the only construction I had. And we can say that is its own lens, right? So my Old Testament in Sunday school is my lens. I hope it actually was a good one. But it depends upon what that lens is. And how intentional we are in stripping it off. And it's the intentionality that I think doesn't happen. It's not going to happen just because you're a good person. It just isn't, because it's still going to be there even though you are a good person. I would say for the people listening, do kind of race amity stuff, come together. My United Methodist Church, predominantly Black, we saw the film together, right, at the synagogue. And I recommend the film, and do something like that, where you're coming together and talking about exactly that question you just posed. We followed up with the members of the synagogue coming to our church, and the rabbi and my pastor led a study on Exodus, which is really important to Black people, right, as a symbol of our own quest for freedom. But then we learned, oh, that's not quite how Jews teach the Exodus, slightly different way. And we had planned to have a Seder together, and then COVID happened. But I mean, there are ways in which communities can come together and say, this is hard space, but it's worth the work. And I think the possibilities lie there. Yeah.
Thank you. And I know a lot of people have been asking how to view From Swastika to Jim Crow. Unfortunately, it's not available for streaming for individuals, but as Dr. Edwards said, communities can access it and promote a dialogue program with it. And people can be in touch with us, and we can put you in touch with the producers of the film, and they can help you with that.
Yes,
we do
I
have
think
to
I
wrap
really
up.
do
Nadine,
I
recommend
is
just
there
want to
anything?
say one thing. There's another comment there I think that's really important in the Q&A, is that just to make everything full circle, that the Nazis were very inspired by, they took lessons from Jim Crow in the United States. So this is, they were not just thinking about they didn't make up all this by themselves.
Right.
It's a very important point to make here.
Also eugenics in the United States,
Yes,
as well as Jim Crow, both of those. And the idea that some people should be sterilized, if not exterminated. And how do you structure a society built upon discrimination, segregation, and difference? Yeah.
there's so much more to talk about, and we will be talking about it in future episodes of the Wide River Project and other anti-Semitism Zoominars. And thank you so much, Lillie. This has been you've been a great guest. Thank you so much, really.
Well, thank you for taking on this topic and sharing it with others.
Yes, thank you. I have put a link to the book From Swastika to Jim Crow that a lot of Dr. Edwards' research is based on. I've also put a link in the chat for Nadine's article about Edward R. Murrow. I will send out a follow-up email that will contain a link to this recording, as well as the link to the book and the article. And I encourage everyone to go to momentmag.com to sign up for next week's program about the new Jewish farmer. And we look forward to seeing everybody next time. Dr. Edwards, Nadine, thank you both very much. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.